topic to just talk about funding. I mean, I can tell you briefly my thoughts on sort of what's happening in the market today, and then there's so many people here on video. It's probably a better use of our time for me to hear what's on your mind, because I don't want to talk forever about things you guys don't care about. So I've been a VC for about half my professional career. The first 4 years were at a firm called InQtel that makes VC investments on behalf of the CIA. So I did that for 4 years. That was more of a traditional strategic corporate venture capital group. CIA came to us and said, we have this laundry list of technologies we're interested in. Can you go find companies that are working on the problems that are important to us? So I did that for 4 years. I was based out here. I flew back to DC like 3 or 4 times a month. It was fun, but tiring. Then about 4 years ago, I came back to the venture world after a bunch of, question.
Hey, you need security clearance to get onto that job?
I did not need it to get onto the job. At some point, it became useful to get it, so that happened. Glad to no longer have it, so it's better to not know certain things. And I came back to the world of traditional venture investing about 4 years ago with SoftTech. Just a quick overview on us. There's 2 partners and 1 principal, so 3 people on the investing team. We just closed our 4th fund. It's an $85 million fund. The 3 of us will make 15 to 20 new investments every single year in seed stage companies. Our typical check is anywhere from 500 to 750K. So we stay very busy. It's crazy. This time last year, I was not that busy. I was basically begging for meetings. Everyone had kind of closed up shop and gone home. This year is not the case. I was a little late because I thought I had enough time to squeeze in one last pitch before I came down to San Francisco. And we have one deal that's in docs that I think will probably actually close somewhere between Christmas and New Year. So that should give you some sense about how busy the venture market is right now. And I think if I were an entrepreneur, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, this is something that Pemo and I talked about earlier, is when I started in venture 4 years ago, the world was very orderly. You had like angel investors that wrote little checks. You had seed funds like SoftTech that would do like $1 million round. You had Series A firms that would do $4 to $6 million Series A's. Then you had Series B firms that did $8 to $10 million Series B's. The world is not like anything like that anymore. When I joined SoftTech, our average round was somewhere in the range of $750K to $1 million in new investment. This year, my median check, just my contribution to a round, was $880,000. So we're now writing checks ourselves that are about the size of the total rounds we used to do. And the average round, I think if I did the data right, is about $2.6 million for us. So rounds have gotten much, much larger. So now that we've gotten bigger, there's this whole new class of investor in between angel and seed called pre-seed. Now what the heck is pre-seed? Pre-seed is now what seed used to be. So pre-seed is now 500, 750. And now we have these other players between seed and Series A. It used to be you'd go from seed to Series A. Now you have seed extension, seed prime, seed 2. You have all these intermediate financings. You have angelless and angeless syndicates. So some days I genuinely feel bad for the entrepreneurs I meet because the world is so complicated. There are so many new firms and new strategies and new players in the market. It can be really hard to figure out, given where you are with your business, like who's the right person to approach. And so I think that makes the world hard for me as a venture investor too, because I had a series of relationships and people I like to work with quite a bit when my check was 400K, but my check's gotten to be 880K and their check's gotten to be 880K, and it gets harder to work together. So I've had to go back and recruit a whole new set of people to work with. I think the other thing I'll just say about strategy is there's a million ways to make money in venture capital. Like you can be really good at spotting product, you can be really awesome at spotting markets that are going to be big, you can be really good at picking people. I'm mostly a people person investor. Like I'm not a spreadsheet person. I'm not a big complicated financial model person. I'm mostly a people person because I'm a seed stage investor, and that's what I do. That's where I feel comfortable. No 3 investors are the same. And so I think one of the things you should all know about venture financing is really know your audience. Like I try to be pretty transparent. I tell people 90% of the time they come in the office to pitch me, I tell them, put your laptop away. I don't want to use slides. I want you to talk me through what you're doing. because my experience has been people who can explain their business in simple English and clear words generally have a deeper command of their business. Anyone can kind of click next slide, next slide, next slide. If one of you were in the elevator with another person who was looking for a job, and you want to tell them about your startup, you wouldn't pull out a slide deck and say, "Well, let me show you this deck of." No, you'd pitch them on the spot about the company. If you bump into a prospect at Starbucks, you wouldn't say, "Let me go get my laptop so I can show you." No, you'd have to have the ability to talk coherently about your business. And at the earliest stage, to me, the biggest thing I get excited about is, does this founder or this founding team have a really big vision and opportunity in front of them? I'd say there's 50% of the people I meet where I say no, they're going to make money. No question about it. Like, they're going to make money. They have a good business. But let me explain venture math to you, because I feel like not enough people put this out either. My partner, Jeff, and I raised an $85 million fund. We told our limited partners, our investors, that we would give them, at a minimum, 3x their money back. So 3x plus the original 85, we're talking $340 million in gross proceeds that comes back to us that we can then give to our investors. Our typical ownership stake in a company is somewhere in the range of 5 to 10%. So if you do the math, we need to deliver somewhere between $3.5 and $7 billion in gross outcomes in order for that math to work. So I need like 2 Nests or like 4 YouTubes when YouTube got acquired. Like, that's the scale of dollars I'm trying to generate in outcomes, so that my little teeny piece at the end of the day is enough to satisfy the commitments we made to our investors. Which is why I will meet teams sometimes that have really good businesses that I think will top out at $50 to $100 million in total outcome. Those are good businesses. I'd like to run one of those. They're very lucrative, they're very good for the founders. They don't necessarily work for my math as a VC. And it's a really hard conversation to meet somebody who you're like, you have a good business. It's by no means small, it's by no means lifestyle. I hate that term, I think it's super derogatory. It just isn't venture scale. And it's one of the most awkward conversations I have, and I have it probably 40 times a week. I think the other thing to do is just give you a sense of like what my world looks like as a VC. So we have 3 people in our firm who have the ability to write checks. I think last year we were presented with 3,200 opportunities, and we invested, I think, in 17 companies. So it's a really, like, the winnowing it's like very few things are gonna make it through the funnel. And so there are things where we said no, where other people that we like and respect, who are smart, said yes. They look the same fact pattern we had, and they just reached a different conclusion. And so don't get too discouraged if you get a wave of no's. I know you're all entrepreneurs, so you won't get discouraged, but venture can feel like super opaque as a process, and every firm is different. So to the degree you can, if you're gonna pitch someone around venture financing, I'd highly encourage you to find 1 or 2 people who've raised money from that firm if you can, and figure out what makes them tick. Because even my partner and I are very different in our styles. I'm more of a conversationalist. Tell me what you're doing, tell me where you grew up, tell me about your background. He's much more of a traditional, come in, plug in your laptop, walk me through your pitch, tell me about the model. We're different. If you pitch me like you pitch him, it's probably not gonna be what I'm looking for. And if you pitch him the way you pitch me, he's not gonna enjoy it either. And these are kind of like the same way if you were going to a customer meeting and you were gonna pitch the VP of a big company, you'd ask his or her lieutenants, hey, like, what style of presentation does she like? Does she like to see slides at the front, the back, those kinds of things. But I don't really know where to go. I do this all day long. I do venture all day long, so I never know what parts are really interesting to people. So are there things that are on your minds collectively about the venture process that I can help maybe clarify? Otherwise, I can just talk about lots of things.
So my question is, when you're the being the next Nest or the next Uber or whatever is cool, but when we start small, but like in your mind, like how can an entrepreneur cultivate that large vision from the beginning, I guess?
I'd say the number one thing, that's a really good question. What's your name, by the way?
Harsh.
Harsh, that's a good question. The number one thing for me that kind of makes me go, in a pitch is I'll ask someone, so what's the big picture? What's the big idea? Some companies, when I meet them, they know. They're like, okay, well, I'm glad you asked me. Like, here's what I think we can bite off today as a 3 or 4 person startup. This is our little wedge, but if we do this, that unlocks X. If we do X, that unlocks Y, and eventually we become a really big and interesting company. And I don't expect them to be able to accomplish that all on the small amount of capital that we provide them with, but I need to know that that founder has an idea that's bigger than one product. It's bigger than the thing that they're doing today, and that could eventually turn into a really big market. We have a few companies in my portfolio. It's borderline ludicrous what they think that they can do at the seed stage, but I actually believe that they can achieve that vision. And that's what gives me comfort that if they're right, and the market's as big as we all think it is, and they emerge as a leader, then they could be one of those kind of category companies. So we are investors in Fitbit. My partner was one of the first investors in Fitbit at the seed stage. If you'd seen what that product looked like, you might not have invested back then. But James had a really kind of big vision about what it would mean to take a fairly large pedometer and make it very small and connect it to a smartphone, and what it could do for kind of health and fitness for the average consumer. And it was a really compelling vision. In a market that the pedometer market itself wasn't terribly interesting, but he had this vision and articulation for what they could build. Same thing with Uber. If you just said, hey, I'm going to be the next generation taxi company, people would have said, oh, it doesn't sound very interesting. Taxi's like a no growth business. Who would want to do that? So you have to be able to articulate kind of a vision of the future that's super exciting and why your company's positioned at the center of it.
What is your time horizon, like 10 years, 5 years, or for your own fund?
Oh, perfect example. Good question. So the question was, what's our time horizon? We raise a fund, it has a 10-year life. So we sort of expect our typical company to take 7 to 8 years to mature on the outset. So that means so the way our fund works is we have a 10-year fund, we raise the money, we tell our investors we are going to make all of the first bets on that fund in the first 3 years. So that's what we call the investment period. It's a 3-year investment period. The remaining 7 years will be making follow-on investments in the companies that do well enough to raise additional capital and continue to grow. So we raised this new fund this year. By the middle of 2016, we will be done making new investments out of that fund. We will be fundraising for Fund 5 and thinking about the next crop of investments. And then over the remaining 7 years, we'll monitor the investments we've already made and we'll make follow-on investments. One more, and then I'll go get this. Yeah.
What the most irritating thing I find in the fundraising part is, I know my VC I want to talk to, but the guy won't, looks like it's very, uncool to send a cold email.
Yeah.
So that's becoming a big thing for me now. How to get, is there any other way, or you got to find some guy in middle?
I don't know if I should say this, but I will. I'm like the vast minority of VCs in a lot of ways, and like one of the big ones is I actually like cold emails. To be clear, you're gonna have about 75 tomorrow morning. That's why I don't always say this in public settings. I do like cold emails. I think for a long time venture's been really clubby, and it's been very easy to just say, I'm important, I'm busy, I get lots of things coming at me. If you want to get on my calendar, you have to engineer a way to find out. I meet plenty of 22-year-old founders who've never raised money before, don't have friends who've raised money. I meet people of all ages who've moved to the Bay Area from somewhere else and don't have a social network here. And a lot of the most interesting people I've met in Silicon Valley who are now like sort of famous, I met them when they first got here. And I got to know them before they were famous, whatever the heck that means. Like popular or well followed on Twitter. And they're just regular old people. And they're like, why did you meet with me? I'm like, I don't know. And I'll tell you why. I do know. I was being a little facetious. I do know. For me, being open to cold emails is important. I try to respond to all of them. If they are well written. If they don't feel like it was part of a spam marketing campaign where it says "Dear Investor," then I'm like, okay, I don't feel any obligation. If this person didn't take any time to personalize it, I don't feel bad about not replying. If it's broadly in my specialty or focus area, and sometimes I miss things, and the people who follow up with me again and said like, hey, can you can you like take a look and tell me what you think? I try to give people my sense of whether it's a good fit for us. And I try to leave time in my schedule to meet with people or to take pitches from people who are new. The yield, if I were to do a cold analysis of the ROI of this, it's probably on average very low, but I'm just looking for the outlier. And look, we were all rookies once. Like everybody was a rookie once. Everyone was a total noob in whatever it is that you do, and somebody took time and like gave you some advice. Sometimes I tell people, you should go get a job. Like you are like not, like this is not a good idea, and like you're new, like you should go learn this somewhere else before you jump in. But I don't know, like people have always helped me, and I never know where the next great founder is gonna come from. So I try to remain open, but most VCs will not respond to cold emails. It's just a matter of course, because it makes life easier. So, you had a question.
Actually, I have several. Like as you were talking, many different questions come to mind. So if it's okay, maybe I'll backtrack a little.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of reaching out to a VC like yourself, that you're open to cold email. Aside from personalization, aside from kind of the product or the business fits into your investment area, what kind of detailed information about a particular product, like executive summary or the slide deck or
I just
what?
like a paragraph. I read most of my email on my phone. I don't mind attachments, but usually if you just tell me like, hey, here's what we're doing, here's the team behind it, and here's why we think it matters. If you have a demo or a product you could point me to, like that's always awesome. But that's really, I just want to get a sense of like, should I spend, when I read them, I'm like, should I spend another 10 minutes thinking about this? Like that's really for me the litmus test. And if the team sounds interesting, like based on background or experience or time in market, if it's a category where I'm really interested, I'm kind of more inclined to learn more. So that's really what I'm looking for is like, if I don't get it in that email, then I'm sort of like, this seems confusing to me. Like, I don't know that a half an hour is going to make it less confusing. I'm inclined to probably just say, oh, this isn't for me, for whatever reason.
Okay, and
Actually, can I go and get some other people first and then come back to you just so I get as many?
A quick question
Oh, yeah, sure.
on that email thing is that is it fair to like specifically ask for something at the end of that email, like a follow-up meeting?
Yeah, I mean, the three things I get usually like, I'd like to meet with you and present. That's a kind of a high bar. I'd like to know if this is interesting to you, which is like the medium bar, or I'd like feedback on my idea, which is the lowest bar of all. And so, it's rare that I will go from a cold email directly to having someone come in our office and pitch. It happens though. Like it definitely like happens. Oh, on the screen. I'll get to you next. Yes.
Hang on.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, two-part question. I'm new to investing. Obviously, getting to the VC Series A where you're at is a level I want to get to at one point to talk to you about investment or to people in your realm, I guess.
Yep.
What type of terms do we typically see when we're asking for $850,000? And second, do you guys want like do you have someone on your team involved in the company as far as being on the board or an employee of the company?
Two questions, like what's the current environment for terms is one, which is a good one, and what do we do post-investment? So I'll cover terms first. Here's the way I think about it. On average, in a seed round, the investors as a group, we're gonna buy between 10 and 20% of the company. I don't personally want to own more than 7 or 10% because when the next round comes around and you're really successful, the dollar size of my check to maintain my ownership position is probably too large for my fund. I also don't want the founders to sell so much of the company at the seed round that by the time I do the Series A, they don't have control. I just think that's like a bad outcome for everybody. So we kind of say a healthy seed round is in the mid-teens to low 20% of the company that's sold. So if you just do the math, if these companies are raising $2 million on average as a seed round, you guys all know pre-money, post-money evaluation, y'all are familiar with that terminology. The post-money on those kind of rounds is $8 to $10 million bucks. It's just $2 million bucks times 4 or 5. So everyone's like, how do you arrive at valuation? It's not spreadsheets, it's not math, it's like ownership percentage and dollars deployed. And then it's competition. So in the most competitive opportunities, the entrepreneur might say, I only want to sell 10% of my company. That's it. That's all I'm willing to part with. So we spend a lot of time with the Y Combinator companies. You pay more. Like, it's just that simple. You could say this is only 3 people, you've only been doing this for 3 months. Doesn't matter. You have all the great arguments in the world. For Y Combinator, AngelPad, 500 startups, the competitive dynamic of the fundraise, and that there's so many people who want to get into those companies, it trumps your counter arguments about like what's a market or standard. Those companies operate in a different, fundamentally different market. For normal companies, I would say our normal pre-money is probably 6.5 these days. It's hard to do much less than that without messing up the ownership dynamic between the founders and us.
As pre-money or post?
6 pre. Yep. Yeah, you had a question?
Have they done money beforehand?
Most of them have. Nowadays, most of them
Like
have.
how much? What might have gone in?
Usually 500. I'd say 250 to 0 to 500K usually has been raised by the time they come into my office. Much more than that, then we start asking questions like, how was the money well spent? Are they where we think they should be for having invested $1 million in the business? Like, where does that stand?
So that's the pre-seed,
Yeah, it's a pre-seed.
whatever it is.
On
I'm
the-
going to come back to your board question in a minute.
Sorry, man,
Yeah.
is this convertible note or is it
Oh, yeah.
term sheet or?
So I would say lately about half of the investments I do are convertible notes and half are price equity rounds. I vastly prefer price equity rounds. Like it's honestly better for everybody. I don't care what anyone says. Like I believe strongly it's better for everybody. But I don't always win, and I'm unwilling to walk away from interesting companies over deal structure, over that particular point. The other question is like, what do we do once we invest? How do we get involved? So I will never become a full-time or part-time employee of one of my portfolio companies. Like it's their job to run it. It's my job to support them. So I don't want to work for any of them, as great as those companies might be. I work with 14 companies and I have 2 board seats. Board seats as a seed investor are very time-consuming because most of the boards I'm on, it's me and 2 founders. So I'm effectively doing all of the work of the outside board. It gets easier when you have 2 or 3 board members. You can share the work. You get a wide variety of perspectives. But when you're the only outside board member, it's a lot of work. I have one company in my portfolio that I talk to on the phone literally every single day. He calls me every single day. That's like the extreme end. I have a couple Series C companies. I see them 3 or 4 times a year. The vast majority of my portfolio companies, I have a once a month, multi-hour, face-to-face meeting with them where we go over everything that happened. For ones that want more, I give them more. I have another one where every other Friday, I spend the whole morning on site with his whole management team. So he and I have a one-on-one. I have a one-on-one with his co-founder. I do usually executive hires come in on Friday. So I will do any hiring things. Like it's his 3 hours to allocate however he likes. And he sends me an email on Wednesday before Friday. He goes, this is what we're gonna do on Friday. I come in for half a day. It's a big commitment. Company's doing well.
This is you are on their board.
I'm the board, yes.
Yeah.
So the reality is with 14 companies, thankfully they're not all high intensity. Some of them are doing really well and frankly like there's not much I can do to help them. Others are kind of going through periods of time where they're just resetting or refocusing and I'm trying to give them space. But it's a lot of work. No question about it.
So your focus areas, how open are you to go into different areas? I mean, your focus areas are certain areas, right? For example, any VCs, I mean, do you think that
I'm
they're-
not that rigid.
Okay.
So there's very few investments I've made where I had a really strong top-down thesis and went hunting for like the company. I tend to be more founder-driven. So the last 2 investments I've made were both in markets where I wasn't looking for a company. I did one in sort of hyper-local news. I was not looking for a company in that space. I just found an amazing founding team that I really liked. And they got me excited about a market that I didn't really think was that awesome. But I'm a believer now.
So most of the VCs are like that, or?
No, a lot of people. So you gotta remember, like I'm different. So I do 5 to 6 investments a year. If I spent my whole year coming up with like a really deep thesis that only produces one company, I'm in trouble. If I were at a Series A firm and I do 2 investments a year, then you should be very thesis driven, very top down, because you're only going to get 2 bites a year. So you should have deep conviction about the market and the company that you choose. Also, Series A companies, they're just more mature. You're picking from companies that have already made choices about what they're going to build. I view myself as kind of an idea taker. I don't tell founders what they should build. I don't want to be in that business. Like, they come to me and say, I'm really excited about this. There's some things, like I don't invest in games anymore. I spent 5 years working in games. It's a brutally hard business. I don't want to invest in game studios. I could talk for hours about why, just accept that I don't. Ad tech is kind of the same way. I like ad tech. I have enough ad tech exposure in my portfolio. I don't really want any more advertising technology companies. And when I usually write off a market or say I don't want to do it, it has nothing to do with the skill or ability of the individual entrepreneur. I've just decided of all the places I could put money to work, that isn't one of them.
I think Amanda, you
Oh,
had a
yeah,
question?
we'll take one from the TV and then I'll come over to this other.
Yeah, is it true that being a sole founder is a disadvantage in getting funding?
The simple answer is yes. It's not a non-starter, but I think what we've seen is being a founder, like who in the room is a founder? Like I've been there, it's freaking stressful. And like every day is not your best day. And most founders do not have the full set of skills and capabilities to do everything that needs to be done. So we prefer co-founders as much for balance of skills as it is for kind of emotional support and like someone to prop you up when things aren't going well. However, some of our most successful teams have been husband and wife founding teams, have been solo founders. So I think when I first took this job, I had religion that solo founders are not good. I don't have that anymore. I just think being a solo founder is harder. And there's certain businesses where I go, gosh, it'd be hard to be a solo founder. And I really wouldn't want someone to feel like they have to make another employee or make somebody a founder in order to make their deck look better. So if it's really your idea, I'm working on an investment right now. It's clearly a solo founder. Like there is a guy who's doing this. And he has a co-founder, but you look at the cap table, it's more like an early employee than a co-founder. It's clear to me like I'm really investing in this guy. And I ask a different set of questions about solo founders because my deep-seated fear of solo founders is they don't have a founder because they're hard to work with and that they can't recruit and convince other people that their ideas are worthy of their time and effort, or that there's some personal, I don't use the word defect, but defect in that person and their ability to attract others and rally them around their idea. And I have seen a few cases where we funded a solo founder. I'm like, man, that company's like a revolving door of execs. And I go talk to them like, I can't work with that founder. He or she is so difficult. Like I understand why they're a solo founder. And that's what you're always afraid of as an investor, that the fact the person couldn't or chose not to recruit a co-founder is indicative of some personality trait you haven't uncovered yet. Let's see, I'm gonna go to this gentleman here and then we'll work over. Actually, can I go to him first? I felt bad, I skipped him.
So in the B2B space, especially in SaaS, you usually have, I'll say 3 phases. You have where you find the opportunity and you build some kind of MVP, then you pilot it, and then you validate this business. Now, what do you want to see from a startup that's in the phase between you finding an opportunity and you have like pilot partners, and you want to validate, the business model? What do you want to see from them? I guess, are they at the right stage for your firm, and what stage are they? And what do you want to see typically from them?
So the question is like, how do you know where you are as a B2B startup based on product market fit traction? Like, when is it right for us?
Yes.
So I'm gonna cut the world in half. There's enterprise startups, which I think of as like, you'll have a relatively small number of customers paying you a relatively large amount of money per customer. And then there's just like generalized SaaS, where you might have a wide number of customers paying you less, tens or hundreds of dollars a month as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions per year. The typical SaaS company we find on this side of the map is probably in the 15 to 20,000 a month in recurring revenue. It seems kind of it's pretty advanced. Like, it's kind of crazy. Maybe 2 years ago that number was 5 to 10K. But now we routinely see companies that come in that have managed to build a product that has so much latent demand that on a relatively modest amount of money they can get to a 5-digit monthly recurring revenue run rate with good growth, so 10-ish%, and low churn, sub 5%. Those are much easier to evaluate because you just say, hey, call me when you get to 10 or 25,000 in MRR. The enterprise ones are so much harder because you're not going to have 40 customers. You might have like 2 pilots, right? And so for those, the good news is you can usually just call the people, and I'll always ask them, why'd you pick this company? How important is this in the grand scheme of things? What other solutions did you look at? How long have you had this problem? I just want to get a sense, are they doing you a favor?
Sure.
Is this really a pressing need? Is this something they'll actually spend money against? Because I don't expect most early enterprise companies to have a mature sales force, a mature sales model. You probably haven't really figured out pricing.
Yeah.
I just want to know, like, do people want this thing?
Now, what if in healthcare? If it's in healthcare, so
Oh, I'm not that
healthcare
smart about. I'm not that smart about healthcare. I wouldn't even opine. I'm seriously. I'm like not smart enough to like opine about healthcare companies. It's a different beast. This gentleman here, yes.
So what are the verticals that excite you, that you want to invest in? Did we learn that already?
I can tell you the things that are interesting to me, where I'm probably on the margin spending more time. I really do like this consumerization of health, like this idea, not like healthcare IT, not stuff that's on the hospitals, but stuff that's taking all of this digital healthcare information and putting it in the hands of consumers and allowing them to do interesting things. Like that's, for me, like broadly an area that I think is interesting. I like mobile infrastructure, not stuff that sells to carriers, but stuff that sells to the CMO, VP sales, other people who can actually buy technology within the enterprise, but where mobile sort of can help them be successful. And I like good old-fashioned plain consumer apps. I just think every year there's a new crop of 13-year-olds who have no allegiance to last year's products, and they will decide what will be cool. So I always leave room in my life for just straight up consumer apps.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Sure. What's your hit rate, however you want to define that, in terms of the risk, the bets that you make and what happens after?
Why? So this is the worst part of being a VC. It's very, very slow. So I've been doing this for 4 years. I sort of know, if you think about my investments in annual cohorts, I had a 2011 cohort, I had a 2012 cohort, 2013 cohort, and 2014 cohort. I basically know next to nothing about my 2014 cohort. It's still too new. I know a little about 2013, a little more about 2012. In 2011, I actually have like some sense. My view is I want to find 2 companies that I believe could return the entire fund out of the 20 that I'll do. So thus far,
Over how many years?
over 3 years.
3 years.
So I was just doing the math. Right now I have, from the Fund 3 cohort, I have 1 exit, 2 shutdowns, and like 3 that I'm pretty sure could achieve the like return, the whole fund. But you gotta remember, every company in our portfolio that's our best company now, I can assure you at some point was our worst company. We were like deeply concerned that company was going to, I know for a fact, I sat in a partner meeting and we're like, those guys, boy, that's gonna be tough. And all of and many of our companies that are now, I would say, our lowest performers, I won't say worst, at one point in time, they were high in that leaderboard. And because we invest in early stage private companies, it's not a straight line. They go up and down and back and forth. And I won't really know the fate of my 2011 cohorts until like 2017. And the crazy thing is, the better the company does, the more short-term data you get. But you don't get any money. I don't get any money for a unicorn until someone acquires it. So it's a very hard business to know whether you're doing a good job. And then sometimes you get things out of left field. Someone comes in, acquires a company, and you're like, wow, like that was lucky. Like that was fortunate. The company wasn't looking to sell, and there was a buyer who was motivated, and they came in and paid a good price. Does that mean I'm good? I don't know. Does it mean I'm lucky? But yeah. But so it takes a long time to get enough data to know whether your pattern recognition, pattern matching, selection skills are good. Let's see. Let's back it. You've been patient in the back.
There's also a couple.
And then we'll do that. Then I'll come to you guys on the screen next.
Hi there. So my question is, on the founding team, can you speak a little bit about the profile, the skills, and the dynamics that you look for in a founding team?
you maybe just repeat?
Yeah, so the question is like, what do we look for in terms of skills and composition of the founding team? So the thing I like most is to see people who've worked together for a fairly long period of time, in relative terms. The ones that scare me are like, oh, we met at like a hackathon or we met at like a startup weekend. Like that can work, but I just worry that those teams aren't battle tested. They don't know each other's personalities well enough. They haven't had enough disagreements. They also haven't spent enough time together to know each other's relative strengths and weaknesses. So I like kind of time in the saddle together. I think that can really help. I like people, a lot of it depends on the business, right? If it's a B2B business, if it's, for example, for our hardware companies, we really like to know that somebody on the founding team has actually been part of a hardware project before, because those are so hard that like we can't actually afford to have you make all of those mistakes for the first time with the amount of money we're giving you. And then a lot of times I like to see a balanced team. If it's all technical people, it makes me worry like, how's the go-to-market gonna happen? If it's all go-to-market people, I'm like, who's gonna hire, train, and motivate the engineers? So I like to see balanced teams. I also like to see teams that are self-aware about what they don't have. So I'm like, who's gonna run marketing? The person will say, well, I'm gonna do it for the time being, but like truthfully said, I'm doing it because I'm the better marketer of the two of us. Like that's a whole. And a lot of that comes from, like the slide I spend most of the time on is usually use of funds. What are you gonna do with the money when I give you? And that usually tells me who the team thinks they need to hire. And so long as the team thinks the people they should hire are the same people I think they should hire, we're like in a pretty good spot. Then I've spent a lot of time looking at like interpersonal dynamics of teams. Are founders talking over each other? Is the body language bad? Like what can I glean in an hour from their interpersonal dynamics?
How do they act in the elevator?
Yeah, the elevator guys, that was bad. Maybe I'll tell that story later. On the TV, yeah.
So I had a question about, you talked about 2 of the companies shut down.
Yeah.
So can you share a bit about why they shut down? Was it their interpersonal dynamics? Was it, egos? Was it, the timing for the product wasn't right?
Oh, one of them was mine. One of them was the company I started. Yeah, so that's how I joined SoftTech. I had started a company and I joined as a venture partner. One of the companies shut down was my own company. I can tell you exactly why it shut down. Maybe the people who work there might have a slightly different story, but I'll tell you why I think it shut down. So in 2010, Zynga acquired a company where I had worked with my co-founder. He ran engineering, I ran kind of revenue and sales. We did not want to go to Zynga for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here, but a good company, it just was not right for us where we were in our career. So we left, and we were sitting around thinking about what could we do. We started building some ideas, and we're like, how come no one, and remember this is 2010, how come no one's building games for Android? Like Android was starting to take off, and we said, well, what if we just do the slightly contrarian thing and bet really early and really big on Android and build an Android-specific games company. We'll take the knowledge we have from the last 5 years building casual social games. And at this time, there was no Candy Crush, there's no Clash of Clans. There wasn't even really Angry Birds. This was like pretty early days for mobile games. We're like, mobile's wide open, Android's wide open. What are the 3 things we need to believe will happen in this market for this to be a good idea? 1, like the Android development environment has to get better. 2, like the Android hardware devices have to get better and have to become desirable in the eyes of consumers. And 3rd, like platform monetization on Android has to close the gap, not catch up, but close the gap with iOS. All of those things did not happen. Mostly monetization. Like we could not make enough money from our core Android audience. And when we started, Android was so fragmented that the amount of time and energy we spent building products was disproportionate to the return we got. The big thing though was Zynga stock went from 15 to 2, and no investor wanted to put any money whatsoever into free-to-play mobile games companies. It was like the market froze. Everyone said, this is just a bad market. If Zynga can't make any money, like why should your little teeny tiny company be able to make any money? And what happens when markets change like that is, when we went in, we're like, well, we'll be early with Android, like worst case is, we'll have this unique expertise and some other game company will value us as their Android studio. We're not planning for that, but like that's our out. But we suddenly went to a world where no company wanted to take on excess OpEx. Everybody was trying to cut people and cut expenses. So the idea of bringing on a team of 12 people. And it's funny, when the market goes against you, everything you think is an asset becomes a liability. So we're like, oh, we've got a team of 8 engineers, this will be awesome. People are dying for Android engineers, so like we'll be this super juicy target. But in a world where everyone else is trying to cut costs, a large team is a liability, not even an engineering team in San Francisco is a liability, not an asset. And so I think we properly diagnosed the situation. Like I had no illusions when the market moved against us. We tried very hard to sell the company and ultimately did for a very small amount of money. But that was one where I literally sat down with my co-founder. I was like, dude, we're screwed. And we went and met with Google. I can't get into specifics, but we learned a lot about what was happening in the back-end payment system for Android. And we very quickly realized that the things that would have to improve to make our lives better were not something we could influence as a startup. We would be a price taker then. Like Google would fix those issues based on their own priorities. There's nothing we could do to work around. And I was like, we got the timing wrong. We were off by, my guess is about 2 years. The other company, the CEO was just not the person. I will not say more than this. He was not the person I believed him to be when we invested. That happens sometimes. Those hurt. But he was not the leader we thought he was. I'll take one more from the TV, then I'm gonna come back to the main room. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned that last year you got about 3,200 applications and you funded 17 of those. Can you talk a little bit about the process that the companies will face before it gets funded, when it reaches out to you and until it gets funded?
Oh yeah, I'll just tell you what our workflow is. It's very simple. This is the advantage.
Could you repeat it? You got 3,200?
Oh, so we got 3,200-ish proposals.
Wow.
We didn't meet with all of them, and we funded 17 companies. So like, what's the workflow? So we have this Salesforce-like system that we use that keeps track of everything that comes in. It makes it super, super helpful. Mostly because some people will email all of us and we'll be like, oh, I saw this company. No, already looked at it. It's in the database. So we'll log it, and then we do first meetings or one-on-one, or the team and one of us. So whoever gets it decides, is this in my bailiwick? Am I interested in taking the meeting? If it's an education company, I might ask my colleague Stephanie to take a look because education's her area. If it's a consumer app, they might ask me to take a look. So we take a look, and then I determine, do I want to meet with these people or not? And my preference is always to do face-to-face. The energy is better, everything works better. I pay more attention, they pay more attention. Next best is like video. Worst is a call. A call's the worst. If I were you and somebody wants to have a call for the first meeting, I would try everything in your power to at least get it to be video, because like I can tell you as an investor, like it can be very hard in the middle of the day to pay attention on a phone call where you don't see the person's face in front of you. If that first meeting goes well, we have 2 partner meetings a week, one on Monday and one on Thursday, and we use that just as a pipeline review. We talk about all the companies that we've met and seen, and I might say, hey, I met this great company this week. They're making video conferencing widgets. You guys should totally meet them. They'll come in, they'll meet Jeff and Stephanie. Then the next meeting, the 3 of us will talk. And we will talk, and basically to get funded, someone in our group has to say, I want to work with this team. I think they're awesome, and I like what they're doing. I want to basically raise my hand and say, I'm going to do this investment. And then if we have objections, we try to talk the other person out of it. And that can go on until it's resolved. And usually the output of that is we come up with a diligence list. So we don't have like a standard diligence checklist. Ours are always custom to the deal. And we'll come up with a list of like, here's the 4 or 5 things that we're stuck on. So let's go research them. And our rule of thumb is every time you work on a company, you have to like it as much or more than you did the last time you touched it. Because if you lose momentum or you lose enthusiasm, even if you can't put your finger on why, it might be something else is more exciting. It might be like you're getting kind of wishy-washy feedback. You're probably not going to make the investment. Like the reality is like, so we say every time you touch it, you have to be at least as excited as you were the last time. And then ultimately, if all the diligence checks out, we decide what we want to offer in terms of terms and dollars, and we do it. That can be as fast as 4 days. It could be as slow as 4 months. Average is about a month. This gentleman here, and then you.
My name is Will. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I have more of a broad-ranging question.
Sure.
I'd like you to do a comparison between you kind of started in this business and today about the diversity, and particularly in terms I've certainly seen and welcomed. There's a lot more women
Yep.
in these positions.
Oh, yeah.
A lot more multicultural.
Yep.
Can you give me some commentary on that? I'd be just interested.
Oh, it's hard. It's been slow. I think the progress of women in venture capital is outpacing the progress of people of color, I think.
Sure.
Not surprising to me, there's a lot of really smart women in the world. And I think a couple of things have happened. One, I think the intake pipeline for junior VC folks, I look at it, I know many firms where the principals and associates are female. That's the future of the industry. That's already like kind of locked in. If they continue to perform well, many of them will get promoted. And if they don't get promoted, I expect them to go start their own firms. So I think that's easier. I think the bigger issue with venture is, I mean, you can look at some firms and you'll see like everybody at that firm went to Stanford. Or everybody at that firm went to Harvard. Odds are like they're not looking to change. So the way that they will diversify or change will be people who have easy to digest backgrounds and experiences will be slowly integrated into those firms. And I think as Stanford GSB or Harvard has more females in the class interested in venture, who have a background in tech or product management, they will look like easy hires to VCs, and they will make it in. But I think it's going to be a long time before venture becomes more open to outsiders, because A, it's a small business, B, it's a high trust business, and C, I just don't think most people want to change. I hate to say that. I think most people are like, unfortunately, like relatively happy with the status quo. I think the thing that's changing is there's more female-led businesses that are coming into our office. And I met some of them who are like, I don't want to put up with this crap. Like I read about like some of these like bad behavior VCs, like I'm not taking money from people like that. I'm going to take money from someone who I like. And then I think there's the whole, are you the customer? You know, there's some areas where I think I'm not at all qualified to judge which product will win in that category. I'm even qualified to judge the category, period. And having a broader set of opinions around the table changes it. So I think my view is like most things in venture change because of greed, not fear. And so I think as firms begin to realize like, wow, if we don't have talented women, people of color on our staff, we're missing out on opportunities. There's markets we fundamentally don't understand. I mean, it sounds crazy. When I started in venture 14 years ago, the idea of an Indian American CEO was like crazy. Everyone's like, you can't do that. The idea of like an Asian American female CEO, people would be like, no, like customers won't like it. Whatever. It's all nonsense. And now, if you were to have a firm that like had those values, you'd miss out on like so many great companies. And so, whether it was like enlightened, change or pure greed, I think people realized I can make money investing in a class of people that are not necessarily right like me and that requires some accommodation on my part, and I'd rather do that than not make money. But that's like I've seen that happen over like 10 or 15 years.
Long ways to go yet.
I'm glad people are talking about it. 5 years ago, no one was talking about it. Everyone's like, VC's a meritocracy, if you work really hard, you'll get in, blah, blah, blah. Totally not true. Totally not true.
So,
Hold on, this guy's been like super patient, this gentleman here, and then I'll come to you, sorry.
As an investor, would you have more interest in a company that has, let's say, 500,000 in sales, or maybe $2 million of solid letters of intention or partnerships,
The question is like, how do I measure like sales that have been made versus like promises versus, this might not be what you want to hear, but I always ask myself, if I believe this company can do $100 million in revenue, and that's kind of the rough and tough number I look for in the future, the difference between 0 and like 500K is kind of noise. It's good to see that customers are willing to pay. It's good to see the customer, that the company can command a price point where the register rings. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small amount of money. And the other thing I find is startups chronically underprice their products in the beginning because you want customers. And so you're like, I don't want price to be an issue. So I'm like, all right, this 500K, those customers in 4 years could be paying $2 million. So for me, the big question is the market big? And do I think, do I think this can be a company that has a margin structure I can live with? Like I spend a lot of time thinking about like, how does this company eventually turn into a business that has really, really good margins so that they have the flexibility to spend that money on sales or marketing. It's why I don't do much in e-commerce. I like struggle to find businesses where net of the marketing expense, unless you're a vertically integrated brand, it's really hard for me to see how you make a really great business selling other people's stuff. Like it's really, not impossible, it's really hard. So I always ask myself like, is this a good business, period? If the answer is no, no amount of revenue is interesting to me. If the answer is yes, then I say, okay, well, like, what signals would I need to see in order to believe that this is the right company?
Can I ask another one?
Quickly, yeah, and then I'm gonna jump
So
around.
let's say we're talking about a social media analytics and broadcasting company. When you do a due diligence, can you give me your input on that? What would fail, or what would make it pass, whatever?
That's a good question. The question is like, what kind of due diligence would I do in a company like that?
Yeah. What are you looking for?
I normally want to know what motivated the buyer to. I find customers are really honest if you can get on the phone with them without the vendor there. Sometimes they'll tell me, look, like, they came up on AdWords and we like click the button and we like the interface and we're trying it. So what I'm really looking for is like thoughtful customers. In a big market, sometimes there's just so much latent demand that people are not informed. They're like, you can solve a problem, so you'll get all the business. But I'm looking for the thoughtful, informed customer who goes, hey, we've had this problem for a while. We tried to build something internally. It was a disaster. We did a bit of a bake-off, and we thought these guys had the best long-term potential. Here's the things that the product doesn't do today that I wish it did. We think they're underpricing it. I'm really looking for kind of voice of the customer stuff. I want to understand, because sometimes you'd be surprised sometimes what people's customers say. That AdWords thing is not made up. I've had someone tell me, like, literally, I did a Google search, they came up, I clicked on the link, and I got to the landing page, and I tried it out, and I've been happy with it. That's like not the most sophisticated analysis, but it also wasn't a very expensive product. So I don't know, I try to always tailor my due diligence to, like, if it's a competitive market, I'll ask lots of questions about the competitors because I want to get a sense of like who's doing well. This gentleman here and then in the back. And then you, yeah.
Yeah, Charles, in general, what kinds of metrics are you looking for the companies that you fund in terms of revenue growth or user growth, profitability, customers?
Great question. I always get in trouble when I say this. Don't tell my partner I said this. I'm not really a metrics person. I'm more of a bottoms up. Is it big enough? So I can say profitability can be as harmful as it can be helpful. Oftentimes, if I find a business that's profitable early, I'm always like, don't you have enough growth to like when those dollars, like usually be at a point when you meet me that like putting those dollars back into the business to grow faster is a much better use of time and energy than it is to sort of extract profits. The reality is to get something done in our firm, we very rarely, at our size now, make investments in companies where we don't have some semblance of metrics. So my rule is some data beats no data, but more data rarely changes your mind from some data. So a lot of you will go out and pitch, and people will tell you, this is great. If you come back in 2 quarters with some more data, I'd love to see it. Of course they'd love to see it. It's free. It's like free. You go do the work, you come back, you show me the data, I go, wow, this data is really great. I can think of one investment I've made where the person came back, and it was the 3rd time, and showed me data. I was like, wow, you double every quarter. I still don't fully understand how and why, but I want to find out how and why. The only way I'll do it is by investing. There are so many VCs who I think, partially to maintain an option, partially to be nice, will tell you like, this is great. Like if only we had more data. 99% of those people will never write you a check. Unless you're in no data is real. Like if you have literally no data, like haven't launched, don't know if anyone's gonna use that product, I think that's valid. But once you have some data, if someone tells you they'd like to see a lot more data, they're probably not the right investor for you at that time. The other thing, like the real honest, like the less snarky answer to your question though is every firm is different. And I think if you look at the kind of companies that people fund, I mean, you look at some firms, you're like, wow, they do really crazy consumer stuff. I'm guessing they're not really into like hardcore revenue analysis. You see someone who does mostly enterprise and B2B, they're gonna wanna see business model, gross margins, cost of sales. So I care more about the model. Like if you can tell me the model, like, hey, we think we can command a price point of $1,000. We think our cost of acquisition is gonna be around 200. And here's what we've got to work with. You and I can have like a spirited conversation about, based on what I've seen, whether that model makes sense. But we invest so early. Like our typical team is like 3 or 4 people when we fund them. They haven't done much. So I'm much more interested in figuring out, does this company have a model that will yield a big company? Does that help?
Yeah.
Some? I wish I could tell you like $10,000, 40% gross margins. In the back in the blue. Yeah.
Hi, so I have a question. So as an entrepreneur, how should I choose my investors? How do I do my DD on investors?
That's like, I'm stunned that entrepreneurs like, on average, don't do a better job of this stuff. It's really hard to get rid of an investor. It's like really hard to get them off your cap table. Like, if you have a bad relationship and your company's doing well, then they won't want to sell their shares. If you have a bad relationship and the company's doing poorly, no one's going to want to buy them. So it's really hard to get rid of an investor. What I would do is find 5 or 6 companies that they're involved with and just ask those people what their experience has been like. I find bad behavior and good behavior are remarkably consistent. Occasionally you'll find people who are like mostly good and have like a few bad experiences. But I think if you interview 5 or 6 and entrepreneurs will be far more honest with you than they would ever be even with me. You could talk to them and say, what's your experience been like? And if you have friends who are in accelerators or incubator programs, a lot of those programs kind of keep a list about what across classes and across time, what their experiences have been working with certain people. But I find a few phone calls usually, and even you can do those cold sometimes, like, hey, I'm in conversations with these folks and I'm curious. You can ask them for references or you can do your own homework. And then I also would say, like, for most of the more popular firms, odds are you have friends in your network who've pitched them. And I feel like I'm gonna say no to 99% of the people who come in my office. They're gonna walk away with some impression. Like, SoftTech is nice, they were thoughtful, they respected my time, they were jerks, they weren't nice, they were playing on their phone. They're gonna walk away with some experience, and that experience is gonna like fan out into the ether. And I don't control that. That's like all, when you all go out of here and like talk to each other, that's what's gonna happen. So my view is like you're always referenceable as a VC, and the more companies you meet, the more data points there are out there about your performance. But I would start with companies the person's worked with. Just gentlemen here.
Yeah. This question is about negotiation. So once you've got to a stage where you start negotiating with the VC, so VC has been doing this for a long time and they've seen a lot more things. Founder has just done it maybe once, or maybe he's just doing it this first time maybe. So the VCs can take advantage of the founder on the term sheets, on the terms, both economics and control. So you've been both. You've been the investor, you've been an entrepreneur. Can you give us some terms that we should be looking out for where the VC can take advantage of us?
Step 1, get good counsel. That's like step 1. So I can tell you the things that seem to like, first of all, if you haven't read How to Be Better Than Your Venture Capitalist or Your Lawyer by Brad Feld and the Foundry Group guys, if you really want like a good book about term sheet stuff, that is the book I recommend to everybody. It's like $27 on Amazon. It's not the fastest read, but it's very comprehensive. The things that people, so it's funny, almost every entrepreneur I meet with, this is why I think entrepreneurs get screwed sometimes. They focus on valuation. It's like the one thing, like I just want the highest valuation. Well, there's a lot of ways to like, I mean, there's things I think are way more important. I think like board and control provisions are more important. I think size of the option pool is more important. I think for me as an investor, pro rata rights are more important. I think the nature of voting, it's a class. There's all of these things that like I care about, and valuation is like actually not that high on the list for me. Because I'm gonna get liquidation preference. So like, and the downside, and I think this is how I think actually entrepreneurs do themselves a disservice. They hone in on like the headline number of valuation, and they don't realize like the fundamental, when you're putting the option pool in the pre, The difference between a 10 and a 15% option pool is like actually pretty significant on a small dollar valuation. And if you want a good article about option pool games, I'd highly recommend you Google option pool shuffle from Venture Hacks. It will walk you through a very good, or Fred Wilson also has a really good blog post on this. Read those because those are the things that, like, I cannot tell you the number of times I've explained this to an entrepreneur. We've sent them a term sheet, we sent them docs and a cap table, and they go, this is, the pre's too low. This is not what we agreed to. I'm like, well, we said the option pool is going to be in the pre, which has the effect, and they're like, yeah, but like I didn't realize that's what it meant. And so like, those are awkward conversations because I don't want people to think I dealt with them in bad faith, but I'm like, we were pretty clear in the term sheet about the mechanic. So these are things that you should just understand that these are the levers that VCs will pull, because those are the levers I care about. Valuation to me is, if I want 10%, and you're like the pre-money, you're like it has to be 8 instead of 9, I'm like, okay, I have to write another $100,000 check to get my 10%. Okay, yeah, sure. For a big fund, like giving a little doesn't matter, as long as I get the protection provisions I really care about. In the very back.
How do you handle cases where you might be excited about a company, but someone at SoftTech has already invested in them, whether yourself or Stephanie or Jeff, and it's a market, somebody else invested in a similar company or in the same market?
Oh, we don't.
You can see it as competitive.
We try to do everything in our power to avoid portfolio conflict. It's so messy. So the first thing we do when we get serious about a company is we say, is there any company in our portfolio that would perceive our investment in this company as competitive? Not what do we think, like, do we think there's someone in the portfolio who has a legitimate argument? And we ask them. We'll just email them. I don't send decks, I just say, hey, here's a pointer to this public website of this company that exists. We're looking at them. What do you think? Most of the time the founders go, don't invest, it's competitive. Because why? Like why should they help me? Like why should they invest in someone that's perceived to be competitive? And we have a conversation. And sometimes it's like, well, we might do something like that someday. In which case I might go, well, can you help me understand, like, how are we talking 5 years from now, 3 years from now? And at the end of the day, we believe the sort of tie goes to the runner. So if we're at all uncomfortable and our portfolio company has legitimate gripes, we will walk away. It's just better. We made the commitment. It also has this reverse discipline, which is when we commit to a company, we go, we know that by backing company A, we are saying no to the universe of unknown companies that could compete in this space. And do we feel that we're making the right bet? But it happens 10% of the time we get excited. There's something. We have 90 active portfolio companies, so. Oh, right here. Yeah.
Any IPO candidates in your current portfolio, and are you looking to invest in those candidates?
I hope so. I hope we have companies that I believe have IPO potential in the portfolio. There's at least 3 I can think of that are achieving what I think are the thresholds that would make that conversation relevant.
So I have a question about the people who are your customers and actually give you money to invest. Kind of how has that profile changed in the last 5, 10 years? And what is a standard person who actually comes and gives you money?
You're starting your fund?
No, I'm just curious.
So the
I
question
want
is
to know
like,
where his pressure comes from.
Who gives us our money and like how has that?
Yeah, what
profile
pressure
changed?
does that put on you?
A lot.
Yeah.
The simple answer is a lot of pressure. We raise from a mix of, so the main, without getting into our specific mix,
Yeah, I don't need
the
specifics.
main people who invest in venture funds, university endowments, pension funds and retirement systems, high net worth individuals, family offices, and fund of funds, which are basically just pools of money that invest in other funds. We have a little bit of all those things. What I would say is the university endowment folks tend to be the ones that have the biggest, they have the most complicated universe because they're usually trying to determine how much of my money do I want in the public markets versus private markets. And within private markets, how much of it do I want in hedge funds or venture capital or private equity or alternative asset or whatever it is. So like we're a part of an allocation. And in the same way we don't want portfolio conflict, a lot of them say, well, if I have two other funds that largely mirror your strategy and have a lot of the same companies, and then like, do I need to invest in you as well? Or won't I get the same exposure by simply riding the two bets that I have? So they're very sophisticated people, they're very smart, and most of them invest in many venture funds. So they'll come to us and say like, hey, these guys are knocking it out of the park. Like, have you thought about mimicking some of the things that they do? Or I had this other fund that's told me that they've become very bearish on the sector where you seem to be doubling down. What is it that you see in that sector that they don't? So they're very astute managers of capital, and they have bosses too. And so I find them to be great. They ask us really hard, probing questions. I mean, their number one question is, in a world of many venture funds, how do you guys win? How do you compete? What makes you special? What makes you unique? The same questions we ask startups. So it's very similar to pitching a VC. It's fit. Do they like you? Do they like the strategy? Do they have room in their portfolio? And do they believe you can make them money?
So I used to actually work for VC in the UK, and I found it interesting. So the university funds, you found them more demanding than places like CalPERS or.
I find their universe to be more complex. The things that they're weighing.
Fascinating.
So just, one of the things that I always advise clients that are looking for Series A money, going to, bigger rounds, is to, before they actually are ready to, start reaching out and meeting investors, because typically most VCs that I've encountered don't invest in people they don't know.
Yep.
So it takes a while to kind of get to know them. And so what I typically suggest is that, we send over some information, and then they just kind of keep them updated as to what they're doing, measurable milestones that they're achieving. Is that something that works for you guys too? So if a company is not quite ready for the seed investment, but they think it may be of interest to you, you think it may be interesting, that they just kind of keep you up to date what they're doing. I mean, is that helpful to you?
It is. So long as I can envision a scenario in which we'll invest in the company.
Yeah.
There are some people I meet with repeatedly, it's because I like them. I'm like, I don't think this is right for SoftTech, but this person's cool. I like them. I want to help them. I will have a time allocation for doing that activity. It's really hard to invest in strangers. We do it sometimes. We'll meet somebody, they're brand new. It's the deal's coming together really quickly. We have to make a decision in 2 or 3 weeks. It never feels good. Most of the companies I've invested in are people I've known, and I don't mean like they're my best friends, but I've known them for years. And I've gotten to know them in a non-fundraising context. Then I have this other pool of people who are like brand new relationships, like new people I didn't know before, who I'm getting to know. But I'd say like 2/3 of them are people where I had like a pretty long prior relationship with them before we wrote them a check. Here and then back here.
Yeah, I know I asked this before, but I just want to ask you, founders and executive team and their compensation, and like what do you think is kosher? What gives you pause when you?
I have a bright line at 10K a month.
You want us to repeat the question?
Oh, the question was like founder compensation and executive salaries. Like, what do I think is fair?
Yeah.
The Bay Area is expensive. Like it just is. And so for me, the bright line is anybody at a seed stage company is getting paid more than 10K a month. I just want to understand why.
That's the ceiling, 10K a month?
Not the ceiling. I just need to understand why. So I've encountered situations where people have children or an executive whose spouse doesn't work, husband stays home, whatever it might be. Like if it's going to be more, like that's a pretty significant cash outlay for a seed stage company. It doesn't mean it isn't warranted. I just need to get my head around why. So I tell all of our founders, if you pay yourself $100,000 a month, I'm sorry, $100,000 a year, rather. I was thinking in month terms. You're never gonna hear a peep out of me. If you pay yourself less, cool. So long as you're not like worrying about your financial situation or feeling like you have to get a second job. Like I want to strike the balance between the team feeling like they can be focused on the work with minimal financial stress. I don't want people who feel like they have to go work on the weekend and do something else unnatural to make ends meet. And I have companies where there are people on the team who are making more than that. Could be an early expensive hire that we pulled out of Salesforce or Google or Twitter, but I feel pretty strongly that like 10K in the early days is a pretty good bar.
What about equity in terms of founder keeping that? How much equity do you think is good?
I don't have a hard and fast rule there. It depends on because it depends on, are there 2 founders, 3 founders? Was it really one person working alone for you who brought in a second founder? Like, it's too hard to give it to a blanket. Oh, there's someone here, yeah.
This is also someone.
Have you invested in any company bootstrapped and then before they're waiting for Series A but take more time to get a Series A funding?
I funded bootstrap companies, which was the question, how I funded a bootstrap company. The hardest thing about funding bootstrap companies is getting them out of bootstrapper mode. Like the things that make you successful as a bootstrap company, like rigorous financial management, like a close cost conscious. It can be hard for those companies to shift to growth mode and to actually spend money ahead of plan. And it can be a struggle to get them out of that like tortoise shell mode of being a bootstrapper. And so I spend a lot of time with companies that are bootstrapped, trying to figure out, are they really ready for the pressures and rigor of a VC, pushing them to grow faster and to do things that would be unnatural. It would be unnatural as a bootstrap company to burn $100 grand a month. Like you just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't be bootstrapping for very long if you did that. And so a lot of it is like you're making sure that the team has culturally wrapped their head around it, that we're going to change the way we operate. We're not going to manage to the expense side, we're going to manage the opportunity. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This gentleman on TV.
Oh yeah. Sometimes I'm a small startup, and I often have trouble when I'm trying to raise funds with investors because I don't know if it's me being a bit maybe too honest with them, but I really let them know that maximization of profit is not our main priority. It's secondary priority. Our main priority is quality. Quality of the service, product, and also how we administer the business. And I don't know if it's because of my young age or because I have no track record, but sometimes the feedback that I get from an investor is either that I'm a bit naive or that why. The big focus on why would I focus more on quality than the maximization of profits. And I just wanted to see how would you react if some entrepreneur came up to you and said, hey, you know what, that's just my secondary priority.
I guess I have lots of companies that are not maximizing short-term profit. They all have a good reason. Like I have a couple of companies that say, we're in a business that has strong network effects. We believe if we can capture the most users early and win the market, it's winner take all. So the thing we care most about is growing the network of users and keeping them engaged. Because we know if we become the biggest network or service provider here, there'll be plenty of money to be made. And so if the trade-off is make $1 today or increase the density and size of the network, we will do the latter, not the former. There will come a time at which point we think we have won the market where we will turn monetization on and our focus will go from winning the market to extracting value. That's a totally reasonable strategy for a venture-backed company. I think it's hard if you say like, we're gonna focus on quality and you don't say why the focus on quality ultimately leads to the big outcome. I have some companies that are really passionate about mission and community, and they care about it because we think we will actually win. We think if we can build the most honest, authentic community and we treat our users with respect and we do these things, it will ultimately yield the company that's more valuable than one that's like ruthlessly focused on extracting every dollar from the user up front. So part of it to me is that you gotta tell me the story about winning. And if you say the way to win is to do X, Y, and Z, and we think the path to winning is to build the highest quality product, like I think before Google, a lot of people didn't appreciate on the investment side the importance of things like performance and latency. And now people are like, oh yeah, like for consumer services, like performance and latency is like a big deal. To say like we want to have the best product and performance and latency is part of that and quality is part of that. And here's why we think it all matters. You got to tie it all together. Because I think most investors in the end want to know that you're going to build the winning company in the category. If the highest quality product doesn't win, then maybe quality is the wrong attribute for that category. This gentleman here on the
Yeah, what do you see as far as equity delegation amongst the founders? Like even blends, any alarms go off if one has a significantly higher?
The question is like founder equity splits. I always just ask myself about incentives. Like what incentives has a founding team created? And I generally am okay with wildly divergent equity splits if it reflects contribution, whether financial or time. And if the founder realizes that if both sides realize that this person owns substantially more of the company, and there's no hidden resentment. Like I've worked on a few things where someone says, no, he put $250,000 of his own money into the company, and he toiled away in his basement for 2 years, and I joined him as his co-founder, and that's why it's 80-10. I'm like, okay, if you guys really feel okay with it. It's easier when it's more equivalent, but sometimes a contribution it is far from equivalent. So whenever I see something that's not even Steven, I spend time trying to understand why and make sure everyone actually feels good about it. And even when it's even Steven, I spend time figuring out like, is that the right answer? Because 50-50 or a third is like quick and dirty. It doesn't mean it's the right answer. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 people who really are more critical to the future of the business, and the third person was an early believer. They should be well compensated, but maybe not to the same degree as the rest of the team.
You mentioned, so you invest in people when you have a personal relationship, at least you know them for a couple of years. So then if we want to ask you for seed money, when do we need to start? And how that first cold email should look like, hey, in 3 years we want to get this.
Fair question. So of the last 4 investments I've made this year, 2 of them were people who were unknown to me at the time. Like my first interaction with them was the fundraising process. One of them I'd used his service, and he reached out to me, and I'm like, oh, I used the service, it's great, I'd love to meet you. So I just like, I knew the product already and liked it and wanted to meet the founder. The other person was someone I met through a demo day at Accelerator. She wasn't presenting, she was just there. And she told me what she was doing. I'm like, this is pretty cool. I mean, I can get comfortable with the idea of investing in someone I don't know in a month. And a month is kind of what it takes for us to get something done anyway. And if I'm really motivated, I can do reference checks and figure out, like, usually if you dig hard enough, you'll find some shared social connections where you can use for references or background. So my guess is by the time it's all said and done, 25% of the people I fund will be people who are fundamentally unknown to me when they came into my office. Just going to be 5 of the 20. The other ones will be everything from someone who I've known since freshman year of college to someone I worked with 1 job ago. So it's a pretty wide variety. I can probably do one more.
Okay.
One more. Who hasn't? Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
These guys.
There's one.
You should do 2 more. One from
All right,
each
we'll
other.
do one. We'll do one from here, and then we'll do one from the TV, and then one from here.
I have a question. How do you feel about a company that has products that can be sold multinationally?
Oh yeah. So the question is, how do we feel about companies that have products that can be sold multinationally? It depends on the product. For software, it's not really that big a deal. For our hardware companies, it can be kind of a nightmare. Just dealing with like the regulatory distribution, it's expensive. So most of our companies do not start off international from day one. They tend to focus on the domestic market because that's easier to conquer as a small company. But most of our most successful companies eventually tackle international. So I don't meet many companies today that don't have long-term plans to go to Europe, Asia, Latin America, wherever, or Africa. Many of them don't have that from day one. And we tend not to invest in companies where their initial market is not the United States. So I'll do one more here.
Tough to do Russia these days.
Yeah, I had an engineering team. I had a company that had a big engineering team in Ukraine. That was tough. Yeah,
Didn't do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna allow this guy to go, and that'll be we'll take us out with our last question.
All right. So, the question is, the pitch we made to a VC company.
Yep.
And then the answer came back, hey, it's not big enough opportunity for us. We have one big competitor in the market. So they got acquired for $1.4 billion.
Yep.
For me, I don't understand why they say it's not big enough. and they have today, my competitor has 30% market share, 70% is of all grabs.
This is the one, so there are many, many things I think as an investor where you can be convinced with data or other things that your instinct is wrong. You could spend more time with the founder, get to know her, and say like, oh, she's great, she's like better than I thought. You can get comfortable with a product. Man, market is just so hard because it's not about TAM, it's not about spreadsheets. It's like, does it feel, it sounds so silly, does it feel big? And sometimes you can say, but like, look, this market's huge. And then I might say, yeah, but it's not growing. Or you might say, oh, this market's huge. I'm like, but it's fragmented. Like, no one has more than 1%. So why are you going to be the outlier that has 30%? The reality is, VCs get market wrong all the time. We get it wrong all the time. Plenty of people told Uber that there was no market for what they were building, that the market was tiny. Oh, black cars on demand. What's that just for like 1%ers? Like, you'll never make a big business out of that. And so, market, I would advise you though, if someone is really telling you that they have deep skepticism about the market size, your history has shown that most VCs do not budge on that. Because of all the things you can change about a startup, you can't really, I can't do anything about market. If I don't believe the market's there, and your time in market doesn't prove it's there, there's really no solution. If the founders aren't great, sometimes you can make a switch. If the product's not right, you can do a V2, V3. If the market's just bad, everything's so hard. So I would say we get market wrong all the time, but I think that's the one thing if someone tells you, I don't believe the market's big, I don't believe it's that interesting, until you have new data or a new take on the market, I would kind of accept that that's that person's view.
Can I just ask you one last question?
Sure, absolutely.
You know, Maples always gets asked about Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, how did he pass it up? Are there any that you guys passed up that you, afterwards you went, oh, crap?
Yeah. It's a simple answer. There have been tons of them that we passed up. Some of them predate my time. I mean, we did get a look at Uber. We did get a look at Mopub, which got acquired by Twitter. There are many. If I sat here, I try to block it out of my mind because it's kind of like
those are the thunder lizards that.
Yeah, there have been and some of them, like truthfully, the answer is they didn't look like the company they are today when they came into our. They look like something fundamentally different, and so we just said like, based on what we see today, we're just not convinced. Like it's not. Like it doesn't feel like a huge big winner, and those. I'll tell you the big one that I regret, we didn't give them a term sheet. I saw Stripe's pitch at YC. And I was like, credit card processing on the internet, that's like a solved thing, right? And they're like, no, it's really hard for developers. And I'm like, it's credit card processing. Like, it's been around for like 30, this really can't be that big of a problem. But I should have realized, like, I'm not a software developer. The Carlson brothers are software developers. They were saying, this is actually a really big problem, and I didn't see it. Like I didn't see the world through his lens. I remember when I worked at Google and I started hearing about Dropbox. We were working on Google Drive in 2007. We're like, there is no way this little teeny company can provide large amounts of storage in the cloud to the internet. Like that's a big company product and service. That is not something a startup can do. We will crush them when we release Google Drive. It just took many, many years, longer than it had been. So part of this job is you do have to have a short memory, but when you really miss something big, you got to go back and just like, what is it that I didn't see? And how do I hopefully not make that same mistake again next time that same kind of company comes in my office? So.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean.
Those were the great questions. You guys are one of the most lively, interesting audiences I've been around. So
at least tonight.
No. Across a wide spectrum of time.
And don't be surprised with 76 emails in your inbox tomorrow. You can go home and drown your sorrows.
While I work on 76 emails.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and.
Thank you for hosting.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. And hopefully we'll find some real gems here
Yeah.
that you can look back and go, man, it was that night at Procopio, that stormy night, and I really didn't want to make that drive down. I am so glad that I did. You
I
know?
also will say that some people are very strict about where they find their opportunities. Like, I only do warm leads, only people. I find companies everywhere. So I come to as many events as I can and meet as many people as I can, because I don't claim to know where like my next great investment will come from. I don't. So.
Perfect.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.